of paper.
Beverly, I'm in the same camp. I think we've got a tremendous wind in ourselves with respect to the economy. I don't buy the scoring, any of these scores. But again, it gets back, though, to Republicans, and a surprising number of them seem not to have faith in supply-side economics themselves.
I know. I'm so glad to hear that the trigger tax hike is not going to happen. It was triggering me just to hear them talk about it, because here is what it comes down to. We do not have a debt because we tax too little. We have a debt because we spend too much. So when we take a look at this, I feel like sometimes Republicans aren't getting back to the basics of what we know about the reason we have this debt. So I'm hoping we can keep the corporate tax rate low. We'll see what the House is going to do, because I would agree best case scenario for Republicans is for the House to be able to sign on the Senate bill and give it to President Trump.
Jenny Beth, we're talking corporate rates here, but you know, as someone who was at the forefront of the Tea Party movement, it's all about grassroots. It's all about ordinary folks, smaller government, and people being allowed to have individual freedoms. Are you happy with this bill? Is it starting to conform to some of the ideas of the Tea Party?
Well, it's moving in the right direction. I think we still have a ways to go, but it's important that we get it passed. During Ronald Reagan's presidency, we had a period in 18 months where we had 12% growth. And in my adult lifetime, we haven't experienced that same kind of growth the way that we did when President Reagan's tax cuts happened. I think that what the Republicans need to do is pass this, make sure we get tax reform, and then they need to come back and make sure we also get spending cuts. We need both. And I can't even imagine how the economy would flourish if we had both.
You know, it's interesting because one of the ideas is if someone, you know, once they lobbed out the idea of triggering higher taxes, you know, the most obvious counter to that was, DeRoy, why not trigger spending cuts? Why not make that part of the deal? If the economy isn't growing the way we think it should, or the way history tells us it should, then how about automatically cutting some of that discretionary spending to make the adjustments?
Look, I think that totally makes sense. I've advocated for years something called the penny plan. It's very simple. You spend $1 of taxpayer money this year. Next year you spend 99 cents. The year after that, 98 cents. You get down to 94 cents, and then you leave it flat at that point. It should be about 18% of GDP that Uncle Sam would consume. You lock that in. You basically have a balanced budget within about 7 years. And if you did that, I think this economy would take off like crazy. You'd have the tax cuts and spending restraint. That's what the GOP should be talking about, not this elaborate scheme to start pushing corporate taxes up on a ladder or a scale or escalator or something bizarre like that.
Well, Beverly, you got McCain on board. That was a big, you know, sigh of relief, if you will. But you still, apparently, Johnson's still really uncommitted. Susan Collins is still very much uncommitted. And there are a couple of other folks, whether it's Corker or someone on the other side of Corker like Heller, saying, hey, we don't want that. Now, we know the trigger's been thrown out, but a lot of people are going to bristle at the alternative if it means higher corporate taxes.
Well, you're already seeing when, as you mentioned, Senator McCain came out and he had his caveat, and as far as there are things he doesn't like about it, I think that's what you're going to see from senators. They're going to sign on. They know that this would be detrimental to Republicans in the midterm if they didn't do something. They can have their caveats in their press conferences.
So in other words, they're going to do what we used to call the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. And here's what I'm really interested to see. So the individual mandate currently is still in the Senate bill. We'll see what happens after they debate it on the floor. I'm really curious to see if that stays and what that can mean for possible health care reform. I've always thought it was great to be in the tax package, because let's not forget, John Roberts called it a tax to begin with, and I'm really encouraged to see that it's still there, and I hope it stays.
Yeah, you know, of course, that's the next hurdle. Maybe we'll get through all of this week, but if the Senate does get their act together, and again, the markets believe it's going to happen, Jenny Beth, but we do still have that meeting between the Senate and the House, and you know, everyone's talking nice right now, but there's some pretty some folks have dug in on their different sides, and it's going to be tough hashing that out.
Well, it will be tough, but a good thing to know is that I've heard rumblings from the House side that they are not going to accept anything higher than 20% corporate rate, and they want it to begin immediately on January 1st. We've talked about that already on this panel, that it needs to happen. So I think that when it does go to conference, the House is going to be able to fight for some of the things that their constituents want to see. And let's face it, the House, who gets reelected every 2 years, is much closer to the people than the Senate.
Yeah, although, you know, the Senate, though, sort of throws its weight around, if you will. But by the same token, DeRoy, the Senate, or that's the body that dropped the ball on Obamacare. And, you know, we had a soundbite, of course, Paul Ryan talking about getting things done. He's taken a lot of criticism, and I think a lot of it is deserved, but the House has certainly accomplished a lot more of President Trump's agenda
Oh,
than the
yeah,
Senate
way
has.
more. Last I checked, I think about end of October, the House had passed about 308 bills that are just languishing in the Senate, gathering dust. So, they throw their weight around as they leap from nap to nap, unfortunately. One thing that I think would help on this is just a little bit of rhetoric. Rather than talking about repealing the individual mandate, which sounds kind of cold and heartless, I talk about it as very simply making Obamacare voluntary. If you like Obamacare, you keep it. If you don't like Obamacare, you go do something else, and you don't have that tax hit you, which is about 80% of the people who pay that Obamacare penalty make less than, I think it's $50,000 a year.
Right.
So let's make it voluntary. Let's make Obamacare voluntary.
Speaking of messaging also, Beverly, it's McConnell, equating this to a Rubik's Cube. Now, I'm not sure about you. I have a godson who could do it blindfolded. I still, after about 30 years of trying, haven't successfully even gotten one side right, the same color. So when he starts to say it's almost impossible to do, I'm not sure that's the kind of leadership we need to really get it this last. We can see the finish line, but it's tough to get it there.
Yeah, I've never been able to solve the Rubik's Cube either, so I'm with you on that. But when it comes to tax code, here's where I would agree. You are talking about a 31-year-old tax code that's kind of a labyrinth of deductions and loopholes. But what you really want to hear from Republicans is that they can be hopeful about this. We can get there. We can simplify it. We can lower your tax rates because, of course, they're going against the Democrats' narrative that this is horrible for middle-class Americans, which couldn't be further from the truth. So I would hope that you would hear more positive language talking about the hopeful nature of this. And I think Paul Ryan has definitely been better when it comes to the messaging.
Jenny Beth, maybe I don't want to get too far ahead here, but assuming that this gets done, certainly the market today says that the so-called smartest guys and gals in the room believe it will. Where do we go from here? Because, again, we did a lot of things backwards. They could have bought themselves $1 trillion if they had gotten the Obamacare thing right the first time. There's talk of the wall. There's talk of welfare reform. Where would we go from here once they get this sort of wind in themselves?
Well, once they get this wind in their sails, remember we are up where they're going to have to pass the bills to fund the government. And when that happens, they do need to look at exactly what DeRoy was talking about earlier. We supported Tea Party Patriots, the penny plan, simply spending 1 penny less out of every dollar that the government spends. And I said it a few minutes ago, let's have tax cuts and spending cuts both. That's what we need.
Well, what
That's
happened
what the
to
American
that, though?
people deserve.
Jenny Beth, I mean, after 8 years of complaining about deficits and government spending, what happened to that? These are the same people that were complaining about it.
Yeah, they're the
What do
same
they
people
tell
who are
you?
complaining about it, and they also are the same people who promised they would repeal Obamacare. We have to keep reminding them these are the promises that got them elected, and if they're worried about keeping their job and being reelected, keep your promises. If you would just simply keep your promises, the American people are going to reelect you, and the economy is going to thrive. We're going to have more freedom, and America will be greater than ever before.
Although, Bev, we always say that, and we think, we're saying something, like, hey, guys, you're not going to get reelected, and 99% of them get reelected by 50% margins. And the only thing now that's acting as a de facto term limit is when they lose committee leadership, right? So once those things go away, they're all kind of quitting after that, which might be a clue how you can start to get them all to sort of quit or at least stay there less longer. Do you think that will work? Do you think any of them are truly afraid they'll lose in the midterm elections?
Oh, I think so, because they know they need a legislative victory. And I think what Republicans are finding, it was really easy to campaign against President Obama. It's very easy to be against things. It's hard to be for things. So this is where leadership does come in. And I would even say, as you see the Senate bill potentially get voted on, go to the House, I would be looking for those state and local tax deductions. That's where you're going to have congressmen from New York, from New Jersey, from California, trying to push for tax breaks for their constituents there. And there are going to be a lot of Republicans that don't want to sign on. So I think this does come down to good leadership, but they all know they need a legislative victory, and I think
Right.
that's what's helping them come to terms to this.
All right, guys, hold on here because we're looking